Hi, Caroline. I think you're right. We haven't had any talking so far.
Oh, thank you, Sarah. Thank you so much.
That's okay.
Hello, everyone. Oh, yeah. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the panel that's been named Morphogenetic Regulation, part number 1. Today we will have 3 presenters, me being one of them. We also will have Zach Sloman and Sonia Lopez. They're going both to be online. So the idea is that we have like around hour and a half of presentation and discussion. So my suggestion is that we go ahead with all of the presentations, around 20 minutes each, and then we will wrap up with some discussion. Yep. Okay, so let me just set my stopwatch. Okay. Hello. Yeah. Sorry, this is not working. This is not working there. Ah, yeah, okay. Okay, no, thanks for being here. So again, my name is Juan David Parra. I come from the International Institute of Social Studies. And today I'm going to share with you some ideas about the reflection that I'm having pertaining the global learning crisis in education. And for that, I'm going to draw on a literature called The Pedagogy of Crisis. That is basically reflections on how can we learn about crisis. And I'm going to argue that interlinking this literature with critical realism and specifically with morphogenetic regulation, that is an approach that we've been developing, is going to help me to enhance the reflection. So let's go directly into the object of the study. Okay. Okay. Yeah. So going directly into the object of the study, since at least 2018, the World Bank and other institutions such as UNESCO, UNICEF, and the OECD have declared that we are like in the midst of a global learning crisis in primary and secondary education. And by this, basically, they mean that globally, most of children, particularly in the so-called developing countries, are like not acquiring like the basic literacy that they need for thriving in life. And basically, they are wasting time when going at school. This learning crisis has been called like a matter of urgency because it's being portrayed as a moral crisis, basically because education is assumed to be associated with many important goals for society, including economic development, social mobility, and etc. So because of that, it's conceived that it's a great injustice that many children in the world are not being able to learn while going at school. So the first part of my reflection towards this was trying to understand better where was this notion of crisis coming from. And I started by making a small survey of recent explanations of approaches that existed out there, comprehensive ones, around the so-called learning crisis. And I ended up looking at some studies particularly published after the World Bank's important report in 2018, which is also included here. And based on that, I have like started to organize them, also based on literatures about crisis. So here I'm taking like these two concepts that I took from Canio to 2018, when he has been making like a classification of the types of approaches to crisis that exists out there. And basically we have like two big labels. Crisis conceived as triggering events or moments that threaten the stability of previous organized contexts and conducts. So basically are these approaches that conceive that crises are like external shocks that interrupt like a normal path dependence, and everything is about trying to get back into track to doing business as usual. And we have like another approach that it's relates crisis as processes, or nodal points of transformations, which emphasize the key role of ideas of mediating structure and agency relations. Basically, is an approach that conceives crisis more as an endogenous outcome of decision making in different contexts. So based on that, I was also like able to start tracing like the ontological underpinnings or the underlying approaches to these types of potential explanations. And basically, I could make the connection that most of the conceptions of crisis as triggering events are much more related to ideas coming from positivism. So here are like some examples of quotes that I have been taking from those reports or papers that I have been revising. And basically, the positivist approach to crisis is this idea that we have a learning crisis because there's a misalignment of incentives among different stakeholders within the system. So people basically, there are not enough individual incentives for everyone to pursue learning, so we need evidence-based policy. One of the approaches contesting that comes from process structuralism, according to which all of these crises is more like a kind of performativity in the sense that it's a discourse that has been invented by some international organizations that already have prefabricated solutions for that. So it's more about claiming their legitimacy as the epistemic authorities in the debate. We also have some approaches, some approximations from constructivism, classical constructivism, in which basically they are conceiving how crisis is an outcome of the clash between global discourses. So for example, the discourses of access versus quality and how those clashes in discourses divert us from making more important questions. Sorry about the Can I not use the microphone? Yeah. Yeah. There are some people online, so I guess that, but I will have to go there because the computer is there. Yes, okay, I'm sorry. Then we have also some proposals from thick constructivism, in which they are also talking in terms of discourses being mobilized, but they also anchor those discourses to specific material positionings in society. So those discourses are mobilized by the specific people. So we need also to engage with the politics of education. And also we have some ideas that come from more historical materialist perspectives, Marxism, types of Gramscism, in which basically crisis is also associated with systemic crisis within capitalism and the contradictions that exist within the function of capitalism, for example, between labor and capital. So basically, like this first exercise that I did was trying to get like the scope of what is out there. But then my question was, okay, how can I learn in terms of how can I learn about crisis? What are the takes of all of these approaches in terms of the production of knowledge about crisis? That it's one of the things that I'm interested in. So for making that reflection, then I took as a reference this book published in 2018 by Bob Jessop and Canillo, in which basically they suggest that a way of organizing this debate to try to understand the knowledge production of crisis in the crisis literature is about understanding the difference between crisis management and the crisis of crisis management. So crisis management is basically associated with the first strand of the literature, crisis as triggering events. And basically, this is all the literature that conceives that this crisis in education is more like a disaster and we have to act immediately based on monitoring and evaluation, lots of measurement. And we also have the more systemic view of crisis management, in which we're also reflecting about on the underlying causes of those events that are happening and created moments of crisis. So we have like these two interlinked literatures, and based on that, we can start reflecting on how those literatures help us to think about crisis. And my first proposal here is that basically all the literature that comes from positivism is much more linked to crisis as events. So here I also elaborate on these distinctions about the types of learning that we can get from crisis based on Bob Jessop's work. And basically, crisis at events based mostly on positivist takes help us to acquire learnings into crisis. So basically, lots of positivist research is trying to gain knowledge from past experiences to try to figure out how to engage into new crisis management routines. So basically, evidence-based policy. It can also help us to learning in crisis that happens when there's direct experience by observing real-time events in the real time. So basically, people are trying all of those recipes that they come from the past, they're implementing them, and then through the unfolding of the crisis, they're seeing how those things manifest empirically, for example, in the movement or not of certain specific indicators on education. And then we have learning from crisis that usually occurs once the crisis has been solved or has been ended, and this is a time for reflection. Yes, what happened, and here it's very important to take into consideration like different perspectives. So I will claim that most of the constructivist and historical materialist approaches are very much associated with this type of learning, and not learning about crisis, because as Kanye also have suggested, to learning about crisis we need something else. We need like an ontological framework. Critical realism, of course, helps here, because we need concepts such as stratification and emergence to go beyond like those events and symptoms of crisis. What is basically his claim here? On the one hand, by stratifying like this literature on crisis, we can conceive or we can realize that on the one hand, crisis management attempts poses par excellence an amalgam of actual empirical type of tendential stratification, meaning that most of the literature that exists out there about the crisis in education is about actual events and empirical events. All of them are absenting the real events, the real causes, sorry. And that's like the mainstream or the dominancy in the literature that exists out there. However, he also has realized that crisis management attempts, trying to understand why those routines are failing, are an emergent property of crisis management. So we have to go through different attempts to crisis management as a process of abduction to start in making sense of what's behind that. And they denote the unresponsiveness of crisis management routines, so continuous failure, due to the profound nature of their existence, and they evoke a certain learning about crisis. So basically here the realization is while by applying a stratified ontology, we can approach to learning about crisis and perhaps encourage more systemic transformations. So of course, these are like principles that have to be also operationalized through a methodology. And here is where the notion of a morphogenetic regulation is going to come to the fore. For the time and the scope of this presentation now, I don't have like the time to elaborate the whole of the model. So I'm going just to outline it. And also we're going to have like more presenters in this panel and the next panel on morphogenetic regulation. And perhaps they will give us like more details into the model. However, I can say some things that can help us to think and realize how to improve our efforts to learn about crisis in education based on this approach, which naturally starts the MR, the M is the morphogenetic. So it starts with using Archer. So this is the classic, the different phases of Archer. So a condition, an interaction, and an agency, an interaction and social elaboration, sorry. And based on that, we can start thinking where to position the types of learning within the reflections. So for instance, when a crisis starts to unfold, as the conditions are in place, in T2, policymakers are going to start to make sense of the crisis by bringing previous knowledge about different experiences from the past. And based on that, the learning into to try to innovate in their crisis management routines is going to take place. While the crisis is unfolding, we might also be able to get learnings from learning in, as these policymakers are applying their proposals and are also seeing how those proposals are being implemented and what kind of results are also emerging at the empirical level when they are applying monitoring and evaluation tools. So the movement on indicators. And the question here is if by the end of this morphogenetic cycle, have they been able to reverse some of the symptoms of the crisis? So there are like, of course, nuances, but two like basic solutions here. On the one hand, at least in the short run, perhaps the case is, sorry, here I have there's no one there. Sorry, no, it's only appearing here, sorry. So one of the possibilities is that indeed we're going to see in the short run that perhaps some of those crisis management efforts worked, and we have been able to revert some of the symptoms of the crisis. So, for example, we have been able to influence against some indicators. Test scores are going up, dropouts are going down. So and under that scenario, then the learning from is going to start to inform us on good practices of what actually did work. The problem with that, or the other circumstance with that, is that if that is the case in the short run, we might end conflating the real with the actual, because perhaps policymakers are going to assume, this screen shut down, the policymakers are going to assume that they actually managed to address the deeper causes of the crisis. However, if that is not the case, then we will have a crisis of crisis management. And if we have a crisis of crisis management, we have to think in different types of manifestations of those deeper causes. And this is where the MR, so MR stands for Morphogenetic Regulation. Regulation stands from the French regulation, the learnings from the French regulation school. And the French regulation school also give us like additional elements to think here in terms of the types of crises that we might be experiencing. So it might happen that policymakers start to realize that their ideational, their situated rationality is failing, meaning that their routines, the rules, the governance of the system is failing. And at that point, they might be also motivated to make deeper reflections about what's going on. But also, it could happen that we arrive to a much deeper material kind of crisis. Basically, this is like the falling apart of schools, the exit of lots of teachers that are not going to work anymore because salaries are going down, and also, for example, all of the implications that the lack of learning of students is going to create in an economy, the material consequences, like, for example, affectations on productivity, et cetera, et cetera. And these types of circumstances might drive them to deeper reflections that is part of the logics under which we might arrive eventually to learning about the crisis. So, of course, as I said before, we will need like much more detail to better understand like these movements here. But for the time being, the message is that definitely in order to arrive to learning about the crisis, we need to exhaust all of these types of learning. And the morphogenetic regulation is a way of moving forward in that type of reflection. Let me just close. I'm sorry. And here, of course, part of the claim here is that as this is a very complex type of reflection that needs also to benefit from different types of theories that help us through our abduction process, that is part of that morphogenetic approach, then we can also profit from learnings that we're deriving from different types of literatures. For example, we can learn from positivism, as they are strong in measurements, for example, in making rich statistical descriptions of reality, and we can profit from them to learning into and in crisis. The learning from is also about understanding multiple perceptions, multiple constructions about crisis. So here, constructivism might also call to the need here. And even though historical materialism is not enough in itself to go deeper into roots of the crisis, because historical materialism does not follow an emergent stratified ontology, at least in the critical realist sense. It's not going to be enough, but however, it can also help us to think more systematically about the potential underlying causes of the crisis. Let me just finish by stating that this is like a relevant reflection. So This is Lance Pritchett. He's a very important personality in mainstream debates about global education, and he has recently stated the following: nearly everything that is known about education reforms, everything that donors are bringing in as solutions, won't work. This crisis is from the top to bottom. Even the elite are not doing well. So basically, there's a claim here that we are not only experiencing a crisis in terms of learning, but we're also experiencing a crisis in terms of learning how to address the crisis. And I think that because of that, that creates a great momentum and an opportunity for different approaches grounded in critical realism. So it's also a momentum for us as critical realists to jump into this discussion and make further contributions. Thank you. Okay, next we'll have Zach. Is he already here? Sloman, yeah?
Hey, yeah, let me just share my PowerPoint, one moment. Okay, can you all hear?
Yes, you have around 20 minutes. Yes, we can hear you.
That's great. First of all, thanks for having me. I appreciate it. I'm going to be looking over at my other monitor. That's where my stuff is displayed, so I won't be looking directly in the camera for part of this. Yeah, like I was just introduced, my name is Zach Sloman. I'm going to be presenting a paper from my PhD, which is kind of unpacking inclusive governance using MR. And this paper is specifically about how we can learn about inclusive governance through the public problematization of inequality. So the beginning of my PhD was, I was actually researching adverse inclusion, the negative impacts of inclusion. And I kept running my head into this question of what's inclusion? Well, what is it? What is inclusion? And when reading through a lot of multilateral papers, a lot of policy work, it became kind of clear that they were just sort of making it up as they went along. And there's a lot of contestation within the world of governance about what is inclusion. There are a lot of different scholarly approaches. So within governance, there's inclusive growth, inclusive governance, inclusive development, and a few others. Within scholarship, there is exclusion through inclusion, adverse inclusion, inclusion/exclusion. There's a lot of different ways of approaching what inclusion is, a lot of contestation about it. And all of this mess kind of shows to me that it is very much in MR parlance in the interaction phase. We don't really know what inclusion is about. We don't know what its contours are in and of itself, unlike the Keynesian period of governance. We don't really know where it's going to stop, and we don't really know exactly what it's about. And I feel like this contestation, this messiness is really, it's very clear in our current political moment. So when I was writing this paper about the public problematization of inequality and understanding inclusion through that, I was trying to kind of wrap my mind also around my own context, the super polarized politics of now. And I know it's a bit classic, I know it's a bit old, but it just seemed to make a lot of sense to me. And that is kind of thinking in terms of social contract theory, a la Locke. Long story short, the public problem of inequality really challenges the notion of meritocracy. And in this period of inequality, and I think it's exemplified by the Occupy movement from several years ago, Black Lives Matters, the Gaza protests, there is a strong tendency towards the delegitimization of the state. And meritocracy is kind of the source of legitimization. I know this is very kind of classical thinking about these issues, but I think it is very parsimonious and useful as a starting point for this research. So responses in governance paradigms, such as good governance, such as inclusive governance, reflect these tensions, reflect the tension between meritocracy on one hand, that which would legitimize the liberal state and the giving up of power to governance, in tension with inequalities, that we don't have equal starting points. And I would say that governance movements are, a reflection of this tension. So my research aim is to use MR to analyze how inequality is problematized to understand inclusive governance, because being in the interactional phase, I do not know what it is in and of itself, and having another starting point saying this is what inclusive governance is with a capital I and a capital G is a little bit too arbitrary, and it proved to be very arbitrary in the beginning of my research. So I will be looking at inclusive governance through how multilateral, specifically the World Bank in this paper, deal with public problems such as inequality in this paper. And that will then give me a sense by using MR about what inclusive governance is. So this is a quick, and please excuse the blurring, this is a quick and stylized historical background, just to kind of get us all up to speed about how I'm thinking about this. The beginning is the Keynesian period of governance. This is post-war until the 1980s. This was state-led development, demand management, and a commitment to historical institutionalism. In other words, institutions were the manifestation of our collective norms. They focus on economic stabilization and reconstruction after the war, and were confronted with stagflation and the oil crises of the 70s. In response, there was the good governance paradigm in the 80s and the 90s. This is the norms-led, i.e. liberal democratic norms. We can talk about accountability, democracy, freedom fries, all that jazz. Institutions first, rational choice institutionalist commitment, i.e. that institutions are rules that we can use to kind of create society in the way that we want to, by manipulating people's utility functions and attempting to guide people towards social ends. In other words, tweaking policy to get public problems right, tweaking policy to deal with social issues. And this was sort of a plug-and-play model of governance, i.e. there was a certain idea that we have these norms, the democratic liberal norms, and certain institutional setups through RCI that we can use, and we can just drop them in different places in order to reduce poverty and reform institutions in the image of these norms. Unfortunately, dropping what I'm calling freedom fries in sub-Saharan Africa or elsewhere didn't really work out so well for everybody. Sometimes it had really disastrous effects, many times. In response to these disastrous outcomes, there was the good enough governance agenda. You'd think they'd get tired of the repetition. And that was in the 90s and the 2000s. This was recognizing that context matters, and maybe just the minimal conditions for these norm-led institutions would be enough. So they really focus on feasibility and prioritize the reforms in their context. This period was confronted by the issues of social justice, i.e. inequality, which of course had been increasing since the late 70s, early 80s. The issues of climate change that were becoming more and more apparent on agendas worldwide, as well as environmental challenges. In response, we have Mamperam, inclusive governance in the 2010s up and through now. This is thematically focusing on equity, sustainability. It is still a norms-led, institutions-first commitment to rational choice institutionalism. But it's a bit more multidimensional in terms of how the scholars and governance practitioners are thinking about social issues. They think about climate change, often as linked with poverty, often as linked with politics. But a lot of the critique, and we're seeing that right now, is that, okay, that jazz sounds really nice, but the economic conditions that we're living in are showing increasing inequality. So there's sort of a tension there. And I think a lot of people, particularly in governance and outside of governance, are sensing that. And that is kind of where this paper takes place. So to engage, obviously, with inclusive governance as being in the interaction phase, I decided to go to inequality, which is even much wider and abstract. So to kind of make that manageable, I decided to create a social field of inequality, i.e. Bourdieu. And so I delineated what the orthodoxy is, i.e. those who are in power and have the strongest claim to a certain way of understanding inequality and have normalized it. And then the heterodoxy, the critiques of this claim. The orthodox approach to inequality is that inequality is just an institutional inefficiency, fixable by technocratic reforms in institutions. Tweak the institution, we'll get rid of inequality. That's it. The heterodox, the critique of this is the critical literature. So we're talking about systemic oppression literature. We're talking about Crenshaw with intersectionality. We're talking about Fraser, representation. We're talking about Mignolo, coloniality, Foucault, governmentality. These researchers, spanning post-structuralist to constructivist research, focus on inequality as a matter of the relations of society itself. Right? So it is in the relational construction or the relationality of society where inequality is. That comes before institutional tinkering. So I'm going to quickly go over some core principles, and thank you for presenting MR before me. And I'm just going to go over my little bit on the core principles and then how I operationalize them. So of course, as the previous presenter said, it's based on Archer's MA. It integrates Spinozian immanent causality. In other words, causes are expressed through the effects and not separate. What this is this is summarized in the statement separate but not detached. So the key debates that MR really engages with in a very meaningful way are material ideational, structure agency, group individual, and last but not least, transcendence immanence. In other words, the whole thing about MR is transimmanence. It is not transcendent causes. It is not immanent causes. It's exploring the transcendent through the immanent in virtue of their transimmanent relation, which characterizes the entire system. And that's very important to keep in mind, because when we do an MR approach, we are always thinking this way from A to Z. So the tools that I can use, given that my research is in the interaction phase, is I have the concept of self-explication. In other words, how these systemic properties explicate themselves in differing forms. Once again, transcendent, right? So the systemic properties at T2 and T1, what the systemic setup is during the Keynesian/neoliberal period, how those explicate themselves in differing forms, i.e. in the immanent, in the interaction during T2 through T3, and so on. Also, the concept of calibration, which is the process by which I can trace this by engaging immanently, once again, through the material and ideational interplay without their elision. Once again, transimmanent thinking. Finally, I will characterize all of this against the system itself, the causality of that system, to understand its adequacy or inadequacy of the different types of thinking in the orthodoxy or the heterodoxy and the heterodoxy. So operationalize all that jazz. Of course, in my paper, and if you're interested, go read my paper, I conceptualized and operationalized what inclusive governance is. But of course, because it's in the interaction phase, and I didn't want to take an arbitrary stance, I just said, let's be quick and dirty. When governments, multilaterals, are starting to talk about inclusiveness normatively, i.e. inclusiveness is good, let's be inclusive, inclusiveness is a priority, that was enough for me. After doing lots of literature reviews of policy and resolutions from the UN and blah, 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 that's what I landed on. My timeline is T1 for Keynesian, T2 for good governance, T2 through T3, and going forward for good enough governance and inclusive governance, and let's see where it ends up. My research object, as I said, is a social field of inequality shaped by these orthodox and heterodox perspectives. The way that I generated data, so how I actually read the different documents that I read in my data, is I used the theory of crisis narratives by Colin Hay. My thematic focus is on the public problematization of inequality, and the data set was World Bank reports, specifically the Poverty and Shared Prosperity 2020 document for this paper, and the critical literature itself. I looked at Butler, Fraser, Mignolo, Crenshaw, several others, to try to get a sense of what is their thinking, what are their commitments, and how do I understand the heterodoxy in virtue of the neoliberal social system. So the process of my analysis, I'll quickly read to you what the specific ways that I engaged with each document were, and then I'll give a couple examples. So it starts with thematic chunking, which is just where I divide the text into boundaries of ideas, the key themes as the piece progresses. I investigate the conditions of possibility for thinking about ideas as such within the boundaries, the discursive boundaries of that text, the presuppositions. I then look at the presuppositions of those presuppositions, in other words, conditionality for conceiving of the world like this, and then I constellate them. So I look at those ideas in light of their conditionality to come up with what is a material. In other words, what has been withheld from this document, but is necessary to it, and also necessarily withheld from it in virtue of how those ideas have been formulated. What can't they talk about, but must be there, but not discursively, huh? Transimmanence, once again, keep it in your mind. So here's my example of two examples of how the orthodoxy grapples with inequality and how an example from the heterodoxy, Butler I chose, grapples with inequality. So in the orthodoxy, you have this quote: COVID-19 has caused human capital loss, they calculate in GDP, and therefore has increased poverty and reduced shared prosperity. So the starting point for them was measuring poverty, grappling with COVID-19 via poverty, and poverty via economic metrics, specifically GDP, understood through income. So the starting point for the World Bank in this document for people, how they engage with people, is economy through and through. People don't exist for the World Bank. People are actually only fixtures of an economy. The economy first, not people first, is not derived from people. It is economy through and through, which I found very interesting. Maybe you don't because it's a bank, so it shouldn't have been a shocker, but here we are. So that was kind of the starting point, and that was also the presuppositions to their problematization of COVID-19, because it was all about poverty. So then I look at the material of that. The World Bank is engaging with different economic flows, in other words. That's the background to this. In other words, the positioning of money. How money is in different places in different times and the political implications of this, and problematizing this using certain schemes of valuation, which I'll get to in the next slide. The ideational side of this is that the World Bank is just trying to grapple with an increase in poverty and a decrease in shared prosperity given COVID-19. That was the ideational side. Another example is how Butler grapples with inequality. So Butler grapples with inequality through a matrix of domination, the presupposition to which is heterosexualization via difference and negation. The presuppositions to this are the impossibility of objects, right? Objects in and of themselves. That's in brackets because it doesn't need to be said, because an object philosophically is in and of itself. So let's constellate this. What is material to this kind of thinking? Obviously, it's actualism, philosophical positivism, and irrealism. I don't think I have to say any of that for you guys because you're critical realists, but that is what's material to this thinking. So the ideational is trying to grapple with what causes inequality when it is a matrix of domination. How a matrix of domination explains gender as a relational power, a matter of the relationality of power to explain inequality. And the foregoing was what's material to that. This is an example of my analysis. So here is my actual analysis for the orthodoxy as a matter of self-explication. So as I already said, the World Bank's starting point for people is not them in and of themselves, but only insofar as they know their economic production, measured in income, aggregated into GDP. Poverty is the valuation of different economic flows, different positionings of money. So they're a bank, okay, like I said, not a shocker. But where it's interesting to me is how they engage with inequality, because inequality within their documents is a valuative measuring device. It also does not exist in and of itself. It is a valuative measuring device for shared prosperity and poverty. More inequality means worse poverty and less shared prosperity. Done. At a deeper level, it is the logic of, and now this is where we're starting to look at dispositional capacities, the logic of disproportionality. What is a good or bad proportion, which enables inequality to be this valuative measuring device. And then at a deeper level to that is the logic of deservingness or merit, or with that. In other words, if the proportionality we see is acceptable or not. So I'm going, right? So I'm going from the immanent to the transcendent. I'm going from the interaction to the systemic properties. That is how I'm breaking down my analysis. That's what I'm saying to all of you, actually. In other words, a logic of deservingness goes alongside any commitment to any proportionality for the World Bank, which is what, of course, informs inequality as a valuative measuring device. But how logics of deservingness play out, what form they take, through which we see proportionality, is always historically contingent. In the pre-modern era, the aristocracy was a legitimate ruling class. They deserved it. So it was a different set of logics based on a different set of systemic properties. But now in a period characterized by liberalism, the public-private divide conditions the deservingness for the World Bank. In other words, the public being that sphere of social life which is meant to be democratically representative of the people as a whole, and therefore, if conceived of as favoring one group over another, would contradict the democratic commitments of a liberal society. Therefore, events which can be seen as public problems, like COVID-19, are problematized when they unequally affect the public. In other words, COVID-19 cannot affect people because of their identity. That wouldn't make sense because it's a public problem, and different parts of the public should not be disproportionately affected because they're part of the public. This is where meritocracy is deeply threatened. Therefore, behind proportionality, understood in terms of a liberal society, is one, that which against we see proportions of the whole, and two, the impulse to deservingness. In other words, meritocracy is a disposition, a cultural systemic property, of the foregoing's dispositional capacity, while the state is the disposition, a structural systemic property. So please excuse the blurriness, but this is a tree that I think adequately summarizes what I just said. All the way to the left, we have the neoliberal calibers of marketization and commodification. In other words, the World Bank turns people into money without ever even touching those people. The World Bank never even had, at least within the bounds of the text that I read, the World Bank has no capacity to engage with people. It is literally the commodification of people through and through. And of course, through their projects, through the way that they would like to alter social life, through policy, that is a matter of the repositioning of money. In other words, the marketization processes. So these are neoliberal calibers. The dispositions that these emerge as are meritocracy in the state. Then meritocracy emerges as dispositional capabilities, either logics of disproportionality, one or the other, or logics of deservingness as part of these cultural systemic properties. And then the state emerges as a liberal state, a public-private divide as the dispositional capability. And of course, examples of this are for disproportionality. These logics play in making inequality a relevant, valuative measuring device for assessing poverty and shared prosperity. Deservingness is a logic used to assess COVID-19. Is COVID-19 okay? Should we problematize this public problem to begin with? Well, when it's disproportionately affecting those who don't deserve to be impacted because they're part of the public, right? This is part of these logics of deservingness derived from a world in which meritocracy and a liberal state are already part of the systemic setup. Finally, the public-private divide, domesticity within GDP. That's where that comes from. So here's my analysis of the heterodoxy as inadequacy. So the orthodoxy is a very good example of self-explication, that process, and the heterodoxy, in other words, how those, once again, those systemic properties come to explicate themselves in different forms. Now, my analysis of the heterodoxy is that it's a very good example of inadequacy. So they do better than the orthodoxy, and I have a very soft spot for Foucault in particular, and they do a much better job. They critique the World Bank's economic focus, emphasizing this relational side of oppression, right? Race, gender, coloniality, you name it, they're very good with it. But I would say that this is still inadequate and is an example of inadequacy because they are reacting to the interaction. They're still part of these chains of interaction. They're not making that transcendental leap at all. They're still part of these chains of interaction, reacting to the lack of a relational focus. Fine. But they are not aware of deeper systemic causes because of their ontological commitments to begin with. That's not possible for them. Second of all, they do not position themselves. So now we're just talking about the discourse, right? First, I spoke about their ontological proclivities and how that kind of positions them within the system itself. Now I'm going to talk about discursively what they talk about. In other words, they don't position themselves within a social system. The coloniality critique, the governmentality critique, they don't position themselves as part of the critique itself. And that is also problematic. We're still in the same chain of interaction then. So this fails to transcend this neoliberal paradigm because this is all set up by a neoliberal social system. So here are my implications. So orthodoxy and heterodoxy are unified within a neoliberal social system. The importance of inequality in and of itself, though, speaks to a preoccupation with fairness. In other words, there is a systemic impulse towards fairness. I hypothesize that this is derived from the commitment to justice within a liberal and neoliberal social system. Yet justice itself is always presupposed by a world with the unacceptable, that which needs to be brought to justice. It's a juxtapositional term. In other words, there is a systemic commitment to negative freedom, which I will be tracing out in the future of this research for the rest of my PhD. Thank you.
Thanks, Zach. Sonia, are you there?
Sorry.
No, it was great. Thank you. Is Sonia here? I think I saw her. Oh, yeah. Sonia, can you share your screen, please?
Hello. Hello. Yes.
Yes.
Hello. Start sharing my presentation.
Okay, great. Thanks. You have around 20 minutes. The floor is yours.
Okay. Okay, hello everyone. Well, my name is Sonia Carolina Lopez Cerón. I'm professor at Javeriana University in Colombia. And today I'm going to present the Perpetuating the Ecological and Social Crisis, Financing Development in Latin American Countries Without Disrupting Economic and Political Concentration. So I'm gonna read a part of the presentation. So I'm gonna be looking at you, but a little bit concentrated. So just well, here we go. Capitalism keeps showing its self-renovating capacity to persist through crises, including the contemporary ecological and social crisis. Development finance is one of its innovations for its self-renovation. Many existing economic theories give most of the way to the market-state relationship. However, other relationships and actors are part of the eco-social crisis. This research elaborates on morphogenetic regulation and contributes theoretically by integrating two institutional forms, inequality regimes and institutional devices for the environment. The case study is Latin America. It provides an abduction-enabled redescription of the ecological and social crisis of Latin American capitalisms, and retroductive theorizing supports an explanation of the interplay between cultural, structural, and agential properties and the roles of ideas as adequacy and self-explication. Finally, I explain the interrelation between two immanent causes operating between the conditioning and reproduction period, economic growth for development. Despite continuous crisis, capitalism has not collapsed and instead has shown its self-renovating capacity through economic, social, and technological innovations. The proposal of mobilizing capital flows from rich countries, including public, philanthropic, and private finance and mix of different sources, towards poor countries has been a main component of multilateral and bilateral development agendas. In practice, official development assistance has moved the most resources for development. However, President Trump's second administration has the goal of eliminating foreign aid, and UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer has set out plans to reduce the UK's aid budget to cover the cost of increased defense spending. It is likely to lead to even greater emphasis on using private finance for development. The financing need for development increases yearly. The Millennium Development Goals and the Sustainable Development Goals have both been underfinanced. Before COVID-19 pandemic, the need was calculated to be $2.5 trillion, and the estimated amount for 2024 April has increased and is $4.2 trillion annually. Okay. The UN Development Goals and the SDGs and the Action Agenda for financing them. The Action Agenda proposes a mix of sources for financing. International aid provided by national government and supranational institutions has been insufficient, and private capital has been included within the portfolio of financing sources. There has also been a focus on financial innovation, including blended finance, as part of an objective to leverage and de-risk private finance for development and impact investing, for example. However, the net value of development finance is insufficient, and year after year the goals are not achieved and the value increases. My goal is to apply the morphogenetic regulation approach to analyze the persistent underfunding of development in Latin America. The French regulation approach is a heterodox school created for explaining capitalism, an interest in grounded French regulation in a meta theory led to an effort to link FR with critical realism, in particular by developing a complementarity with Canillo's immanent causality morphogenetic approach. Canillo follows earlier proposals to connect FR and CR. Yes, this has been already presented by Juan David and Zach. So I'm gonna skip it a bit, and I move into basically what I have developed. I elaborate on the MR approach and contribute theoretically by integrating two recently added institutional forms made by Boyer 2022. First, inequality regimes and institutional devices for the environment. Boyer added these two new institutional forms due to the increasing perceptions that there's an exacerbation of inequality that is impeding the restructuring of societies, and second, ecological constraints are at the center of two of the development modes. For recomposing contemporary economies, this application of the framework to the thematic field of financial development centers on three institutional forms: the insertion of the state into the world economy and the two institutional forms already mentioned, inequality regimes and institutional devices for the environment. There is no doubt of the importance of analysis using the original 5 institutional forms, but the goal here is to contribute towards how we can reconfigure the development financing approach to one which challenges inequalities and works within ecological constraint, and thereby unveil what conditioning is needed to move towards flourishing morphogenetic societies in Latin America. So this paper focuses on Latin America and the persistent underfunding of development in the region. Canillo is used to analyze the interplays between a structural and cultural dimension in FR schools terms between growth regimes and regulation regimes, and how structure and agency emerge, intertwine, and redefine each other and over time. At the same time, and overcoming the lesion, the paper analyzes the persistence of cultural, structural, and agential properties with their interplays, and uses the notions of ideas as adequacy, ideas as self-explanation, and analytical mechanisms. As a result, the explanation of the interplay between the structural, cultural, and agential properties using ideas as adequacy and self-explication allows us to explore the ideas operating between the conditioning period T1 and the reproduction period T1B. I use abduction as a mode of inference and retroductive theorizing. Abduction enabled redescription of the phenomena under study, the ecological and social crisis of Latin American capitalisms. The theories most commonly used for explaining these phenomena from economics are classical, neoclassical, Keynesian, and post-Keynesian economics. French regulation theory has used for collecting literature for describing the phenomena, which allowed retroductive theorizing to start by moving towards a redescription using MR. The initial French regulation schools' institutional forms were not sufficient for explaining the causal mechanisms underneath the ecological and social crisis. The IF, the institutional forms, the insertion into the world economy was most important for the retroduction process because of its connection to ecological degradation and the global south. Analysis of literature collected through this theory-laden approach led to proposing a addition to the MR by adding the developing two additional institutional forms, inequality regimes and institutional devices for the environment. In light of the crisis under study and the relevance for the present moment of humanity, in total, the 7 institutional forms give a better explanation of the phenomena. So, well, here is the, I hope you can, was not moving really. Here is the scheme that I'm gonna be explaining. So I'm gonna go period by period, but I'm going to start with explaining first the growth regimes, the material dimension, and then the cultural dimension, and then I'm going to go into the different periods that I developed through this analysis. So regarding the growth regimes, the material dimension, the Latin American growth regimes have been a variety of natural resource-based rentier regimes during the last 150 years, 1870s to the present. The internationalization process of that period, which contributed to the constitution of the Latin American regimes, involved relational compatibility processes with other regimes. The US has been the main Latin American trade partner, and during this period, the US growth regime transformed from a Fordist regime to the knowledge-based economy, finance-led regime. It's a combination of the 1990s. At the same time, Latin American natural resource-based rentier regimes have been in compatibility processes with the EU's various sport innovation-led regimes and certain levels of finance-led regimes, and with Asia, mainly China's new capitalism. While China has become a key actor in development financing in Latin America, here I focus on the conditioning and continuation of the complementarities between Latin America and US and later EU. The integration of Asia should be addressed in further research. The cultural dimension, the regulation regimes and the modes of regulations. Latin Americans' regulation regimes respond to the specific historical development of colonization and independence processes. The cultural formation of new nation-states was impacted using mechanisms from violence to law for shaping what beliefs were and were not acceptable across diversity of Latin American countries. While here I don't explore in depth the original five institutional forms, these processes clearly conditioned and are shaped by asynchronously and synchronously the monetary regimes, wage labor nexus, forms of competition, the state economy nexus, and the insertion of the state into the world economy across the Latin America. Meanwhile, at the interaction phase, the explanation of the cultural dimension uses modes of regulations, A, formal rules and laws, second, social pacts and deals degenerated by institutionalized compromises, and third, the body of ideas, norms, and routines defines the system. In this phase, the analysis of the ideas as self-explication gives an analytical tool for further explaining the agent's behavior. This is a quote from Canillo. Corporate agents become self-aware and conscious of the forms that characterize their milieu. This allows them to build a more well-defined strategy of action and identity in accordance with the milieu that surrounds them. At the reproduction elaboration phase, it is possible to analyze the emerging properties being mediated and to look backwards to understand how the ideas as adequacy were operating from the conditioning phase and the reproduction elaboration phase. So the analysis develops by periods with the conditioning T1, which is the first period, starting with the consolidation of Latin American nation states, and the need of industrializing countries for financing developing in Latin America through debt for getting the raw materials needed for their industrialization processes. Between 1850 and 1910, foreign capital flows in the form of debt from Europe financed the development of infrastructure in Latin America to support extraction of raw materials. The consolidation of nation states in Latin America included the formation of the banking system. And internally, Latin American elites had control over productive land through the expansion of haciendas. There are big systems of production, land production, basically, and started to create private banks too. Their control over productive lands resulted from the appropriation of collective indigenous lands and business households. From 1910 to 1945, loans from U.S. private banks and direct foreign investment increased the capital flows from the U.S. and U.K. These forms of financing Latin American development reinforce Latin American dependent position in the integration into the international economy. From the cultural dimension, with the same focus on the regulation approach, institutional forms, but from the ideational dimension, the discourses on the American dream were present in the US and Latin America during the US for this regime. Latin America supported the American dream by following the initial development prescription of getting loans for building infrastructure to provide the US and industrializing countries with their raw materials. The consolidation of Latin American states built on the ideas of liberal individualism dominating in the UK and US. Free trade liberalism facilitated imports of textile into Latin America, replacing the local artisan production. The independence processes preserve racial hierarchies and class hierarchies joining the racial hierarchies. Europeans continue to have the highest social position, followed by criollos, Europeans descendants, and these two groups would be the elites ruling Latin America. This would also be the racial hierarchy for establishing LA inequality regimes. The groups in the lower parts of the social pyramid would struggle to achieve social mobility, and groups at the top would preserve their wealth and privilege due to their position. Indigenous communities' relations with nature were overshadowed in the consolidation of the nation states in Latin America. During the independence period, indigenous land was governed with the terra nullius doctrine, considering it nobody's land or inhabited by barbarians. This doctrine supported the expansion of the agricultural and animal husbandry land frontier, using military forces to move out indigenous inhabitants. The agricultural and animal husbandry practices then adopted were mainly colonial, and the indigenous people were used to apply them. Indigenous communities' ancestral knowledge was neglected. The interaction period T2, T3 starts with the creation of the Economic Commission of Latin America and the Caribbean in 1984. In this period, the U.S. led the design of development financing in Latin America. Analysis of the material dimension in this period centers on the complementarity of the U.S. for this regime and the Latin America rentier regimes, while the cultural dimension centers on the regulation regimes established to support this process of financing development. In T2, T3, the institutionalization process of financing development happened using two complementary mechanisms, foreign aid through ODA and private funds through foreign direct investment. This is a period which has important cultural component for supporting the establishment of a complementarity between the US and LA regimes. EU regimes also were interested in Latin America, and there's a multilateral intention which support the transition from US-LA financing development relation to a multilateral, mainly North-South financing for sustainable development relation. The interaction period had a pressure for land. Solutions were diverse across Latin America. On one hand, colonization reduced the pressure on latifundios, and on the other hand, land reforms were proposed by the US government to reduce the possibility of the propagation of communist ideas. The 1960s, 1980s were a period of government support for land colonization. The governments of Brazil, Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru were especially supportive, including by sponsoring the deforestation of lowlands forest regions for making improvements and claiming property rights. There were indigenous communal lands. Within these lands, indigenous territorial rights were vulnerable because of the interest in increasing the amount of fertile land dedicated to agriculture and cattle keeping. The situational logic is one of protection. Corporate agents in T2, T3 are the government ruling class in US, Europe, and Latin America. US and European companies are transforming Latin American raw materials too. Foreign aid for Latin American countries evolved under US leadership. which established a systemic coherence between the two growth regimes. Latin American development financing was based on ODA and the FDI. Latin American countries, which aligned to the US model of development adapted to US policy advice, including by making market-oriented reforms. The interaction period, T2, T3, included the establishment of the foreign aid pattern as a response to donors' strategic foreign policy concerns. Some Latin American governments implemented a militarized neoliberalism model through which corporate agents found a strategic way to nullify opposition from what Archer and Canillo call active actors. Between 1982 to 2004, implementation of neoliberal policies in Latin America supported the rise of civilian authorities with militaristic values. This storm facilitated the foreign imposition of market-led policy while suppressing responses from civil society. The result was civilian militarism, which paved the path for authoritarian governments. There was a continuation where corporate agents, Latin American elites, transitioned to the new ideas and used them in support of their vested interests. Elites had the capacity to adapt the ideas and policies of first the protectionist state and later neoliberalism. Public policy design based on neoliberal ideas and their application was aligned with protecting the dominant elite's interests. As Navarro argues, it was not a conflict between North and South, but between an alliance of dominant classes of North and South against dominated classes of North and South. Neoliberal ideas and policies claim they would reduce the state in favor of the free market, but the policy design and implementation favored elites over the free market. For example, the privatization of public companies was mainly developed in a way that supported economic concentration. During T2 and T3, European foreign aid for Latin America began opening the possibility for multilateralism. And at the end of T1 in 1980, the political dialogue between EU and LA began, while some Latin American countries had existing bilateral arrangement with some EU countries. Well, let's go to the ideas of self-explication, land reforms, industrial substitution, implementation policy, and some keeping economic concentration and corporate agents domination. So,
hello, Sonia, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, you have 2 minutes left.
2 minutes, okay.
Yeah.
So some Latin American elites managed to avoid expropriation of lands in land reforms by foreseeing strategies to adapt their properties to the land reform law or by blocking the implementation of the reform. They subdivide the land to reduce the size of the latifundio and preserve the properties. And finally, I'm gonna jump. Reproduction elaboration period T3, T4, T5 is the sustainable finance era where growth regimes continue interaction and new financial products were created by achieving the sustainable development goals. They are designed under a similar logic to the products of T1, opening a space to private capital supported by financial innovation to lower the risk faced by private investors. And I'm going to jump to ideas as adequacy, absented the absences, financing development in Latin America, poor economic growth, perpetuating social inequality. I propose to focus on two interrelated and complementary immanent causes, the idea of development or the relation of development and the idea of economic growth for achieving development. The idea of development has been presented persistently during the whole period of analysis. This idea has been accompanied by the economic growth imperative as the necessity for achieving development. Economic growth is a persistent idea that supports the North's growth regimes, regulation modes, and socio-economic structure and designing or maintaining the development of Latin American rentier regimes and associated regulation modes with corporate agents adapting and finding ways of appropriation. Economic growth for development is fundamentally related to the economic dimension of the accumulation regime and is present in the political dimension too. In aid, grants, and loans for development programs in Latin America were mainly evaluated by calculated impact on income growth, whereas inequality in the distribution of the income was not included in evaluations. The political dimension has the main task of preserving as much as possible the access to income and to the decisional power for making distributional decision over the income. And this is just the end. So, well, here are basically the capitalist mode of accumulation is in crisis, but the powers and economic relations are not. In a capitalist mode of accumulation, what must be persistent are the structure of accumulation. Sustainable finance has the capacity to preserve these relations. Economic growth is a necessary condition, but it is more fundamentally the preservation of power relations, which allows the accumulation of what economic growth provides. Sustainable finance has the potential to combine the three fictitious commodities through innovative and traditional finance products, which by design instrumentalize social inclusion and indigenous worldviews. Sustainable finance can also offer financing possibilities designed using a different locally based approach with respect to the spirit of the place. And I think I have to finish there, right? Oh no? Should I continue?
Can we turn the lights on? Yes, no.
Latin America is enormously diverse. Polanyi gives inputs for understanding the economic relations constituting the economy. It is necessary to recognize the diversity and the value of nature, labor, and money, and the danger of their commodification. The coexistence of different forms of economic integration supports the dominant market economy. Coexistence is part of the real economy, and the subsidized market economy is an outcome. The local and regional economies in Latin America are diverse and have been interacting and finding ways to integrate into the market economy. The social and ecological crisis require collective responses to the persistence of the ranges of growth. Okay, finished.
Yep. Yes, thank you very much. You already received claps here. Thanks a lot. Okay, no, thanks a lot for the audience for staying here. I guess we have around 15 minutes if you want to make some questions. My suggestion is that we grab like 2 or 3 questions and then you can direct them to whoever you want to direct them. Yes, so let's start. Yes, please.
Thank you so much. I wanted to ask a question to the second speaker, who was saying that the heterodoxy, basically, he was critiquing that, you know, the heterodox critics of inequality are not putting themselves as part of the critic or part of the critique. And I wanted to ask whether he might be able to elaborate a little bit more how they should have put themselves into the position of the critique or the critics. And how is it that the morphogenetic regulation is able to do better? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Do we have more questions? Okay. Okay. Okay, so let's get the questions and then we can.
You want all the
react?
questions to start?
Yeah, and then we can. No, but Zach, you took note of the question? Yeah, he took note.
Yeah, I got it.
Yeah.
Okay, my question is more around your presentation on crisis management and crisis techniques. And I think, if I got it right, you were saying, which I really enjoyed, by the way, you said that crisis learning tends to tend towards positivism. Is that right? That I understood that way, that crisis learning tends towards positivism? Because my understanding is that really crisis learning tends to more towards the methodological primacy of the pathological and trying to seek out the identification of mechanisms that were revealed through the crisis that may be subsequently prevented in future to prevent future crises or to make crisis management better in the future.
Okay. I have noted that one down. And yes, Honor.
Well, thank you all speakers for these wonderful presentations. So a question for Daniel, but maybe perhaps also to all the speakers. So you had in one of the slides the set of a constellation of concepts, calibers, dispositions, and dispositional capabilities, and then there was one more. So a disposition is, as I understand it correctly, within Karim Kinyo's terminology, it's something like a property, and a dispositional capability is something like a tendency. Then what is a caliber, and how could anything be more basic than property? So where do we situate that under, how do we situate something under properties? How could something be more basic? Questions about that. Thank you.
Okay, great. So, Zach, do you like to react to your first question?
Yeah, sure. Let me just go back to my little note. Right. So how could the heterodoxy do better? And also how would MR do better? That's kind of what I got from it. First of all, so the heterodoxy's critique, as I said, is a matter of interaction. And when thinking about MR and thinking through MR, and that's an important thing, right? So once again, kind of going back to transimmanence, thinking about it, but also thinking through it. The interaction is just one phase. So the heterodoxy is looking at this is what's lacking, this is what we can add, which is kind of ironic because they actually speak a lot through negativity, right? And that's their whole thing in post-structuralism very often. But they are looking at what can be added. Now, they are not repositioning themselves, so as part of a social system. And an MR argument would be that real transformation requires this systemic perspective. Real transformation, a CR actually read on this, is that real transformation requires a stratified emergentist understanding, because without objects, without a real, there's no change, there's no transformation. Everything is at the actual level, which is borne out in my analysis of Butler's work, but all the other work. Everything is really at the actualist level. So without a real, without another ontological level, without any more depth, there is no possibility of real transformation, and that is kind of where their shortcoming is. So in other words, and I know this sounds a bit unfair, but that's the whole point of this meta-theoretical enterprise, they would have to give up their ontology. They would have to kind of move past that to look at what real transformation looks like, at least in terms of a CR perspective. Sorry, I will look at you now because I don't need to look at the screen. How does MR do better? It's just that, in my analysis, we're starting to delineate what inclusion is with depth. We're starting to delineate what inclusion is vis-a-vis previous periods of governance, vis-a-vis different systemic properties, and then what it might be. What is the jumping off point? In other words, we're situating inclusion. I'm situating inclusive governance and thinking about inclusive governance in virtue of the social system in which all of that is playing out. And I think that is kind of MR's contribution, thinking in, thinking through, and thinking about. It is this kind of transimmanent approach, right? That is the contribution. I think it gives that, and I think in line with CR, it always creates those extra levels. I don't know, that's a very abstract explanation, but does that make sense?
Yes, Zach, thanks. And would you like to say something about the third question on the caliber?
Yeah, I can try. I hope I'm not going to get more abstract, but I'm going to give it a shot, right? So the question was, what's more basic than a property, right? Because if we're talking about properties, we're at the real, right? But when we're thinking in MR terms, and Karim, don't kill me. When we're thinking in MR terms, we're thinking also over time, and we're thinking about the possibility of properties. We're not just thinking about the conditions of possibility, right? Because then you're in properties, boom. We're thinking about conditionality. What is the condition? That we see properties as such. So MR basically takes CR and keeps CRing. It keeps looking at that emergence deeper and deeper and deeper when we're creating a system for our analysis. And that is what Calibre does, right? It looks at what is the system such that we see the properties as we do. So in other words, it deepers the emergentist ontology. It follows it through at the next level and then the next level. And that is also what Calibre's to dispositional capabilities discusses, right? Because properties are only in one strata. You know, perhaps a different strata doesn't have those properties, but for an MR theorist, it's important to understand why or how that plays out. Why should the properties be in the strata as we see it? Why is it neoliberalism as a caliber? Why is it the calibers of commodification and marketization? Why is the logic of deservingness? Where does that come from? What's behind that? And what is behind that thing that's behind that, such that it is behind that? How does that line up? So, in other words, kind of going back to my previous answer, Calibers is just taking that explanation to the next emergentist strata, the next level. And it is a way also of engaging with the material and ideational, which we as MR theorists and actually all social researchers, we're always engaging with material and ideational in one way or another through interaction, right? That's the only way, exdurance, right? Is the only way that we can engage in social reality. It is the immanence, it is the interaction, our experience, right? That is all we have. But Calibers allows us to take that information, that material and that ideational information, and then calibrate it, actually put it in dialogue with each other such that it's part of this system of emergent stratification. That is kind of the contribution of calibration and calibers, as far as I see it, as far as I used it. I hope that wasn't too abstract.
Yes, Andrew? Okay. Okay, great. And okay, great. Thanks. And regarding the question posed to my presentation, if the crisis, the literature on crisis tends to positivism, I think that particularly in the field of education, that it's where I've been applying this, I can say that using like this categorization of different traditions of crisis seen as triggering events and distinguish it from crisis seen as processes, I will link definitely the first strand towards a much positivist approach. But definitely part of the also the argument is that it's a very rich literature. It's founded in many ontological positions. So I presented some of them are most associated with positivism, some of them are more associated with historical materialism, constructivism. There's like a constellation of, and the claim of the presentation is that we need to figure out also methodologically how to derive learnings from all of those approaches to have a more comprehensive pedagogy of crisis. So that was like the take of the presentation. Yeah, I hope that answers that. Okay. We still have some minutes. Is there any additional question? No? For now? Yep. Yep. Is there anyone online that want to pose a question to any of the presenters? There's a comment in the chat, but please don't write them in the chat. Please just open your mic if you want to ask something. Okay, no, it seems that we don't have any more questions. So thanks a lot for your attendance, and yes, hope to continue the conversation later on. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Hey, thank you very much.
Okay, bye guys. Thank you. Thanks to people online as well.